Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you this morning. The journey I'm going to take you on is, and the stories I'm going to tell and share with you are incidences. They're some of New Zealand's history that I've been fortunate to be part of. And so this is not talking to you about a piece of research or about observing remotely some of the things that have gone on in New Zealand. I've had the good fortune to be really part of this. And when I do in-depth training on this, sometimes I cry. And that emotion comes not from all the harm and the hurt I've seen, because I've sat down with hundreds of victims and through that witness some of the horror that no human being should have to go through. But that emotion comes from the healing that I've experienced, both from the victim and from the offenders. Professor Howard Zare said the New Zealand model of family group conferencing, when it's done as it's designed to be, is probably the most restorative process in the world. And it's because it's not just about putting right with the victim. It's about restoring the young person with their family and the young person and their family with the community. So it's a bigger than victim-offender mediation. New Zealand didn't develop this process for restorative justice. It wasn't even on our minds. We were being challenged by the Maori people in New Zealand because 86% of people that were incarcerated in New Zealand were Maori, and they only made up 10% of the population. And they accused us of being institutionally racist. And at first I didn't understand what that meant. And I said, I'm not racist. But they weren't saying I was racist. They were saying that our institutions were racist. They were developed on the values of one culture. And that's exactly what they were. And when they pointed out to us that the triangle that made up that institutional racism, it was our government, our religions, and our education institutions. They set the values of our institutions. I wrote a paper when I was studying at university about pride versus mana. And mana is the Maori equivalent to pride, but in a far deeper way. And the pride of the European and colonising New Zealand gave no value to the culture that they ended up destroying in many ways. Now, New Zealand has had a number of firsts in the world. Sometimes when you get feedback, people think, in fact, when I moved to Australia, I remember one of the young women there saying to me, the women in New Zealand run around topless and in grass skirts. And I said, do you think I'd be here if that was true? New Zealand has a very good education system, and we've led the way in some surprising ways for a small country. We've become a big voice in the world for our size. We're the mouse that roared. And it's not just around this, but it's our way of finding new solutions by being isolated from the rest of the world. One of the first was we were the first country to give women the vote. A lot of people don't realise that. We're also the first country to adopt the 40-hour week as a working week. Lord Rutherford, a New Zealander, was the first man to split the atom in Britain. It was a New Zealander that led your space exploration program on the trip to the moon. Can't remember his name right now, but he's been honoured both in America and New Zealand for those efforts. In smaller achievements, New Zealand, it was a farmer that needed to find a way of getting up the rivers on the Canterbury Plains, and he invented the jet engine for boats. And to prove its worth, it was the first powered boats to go up the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. It was this, we call it number 8 wire attitude, repair anything with a piece of number 8 wire, that drove us to find new solutions for things. And this came about with this challenge of institutional racism. The minister at the time, Anne Herkis, was the Minister for Social Welfare and the Minister of Police. It was a good combination, and it was right for this time. It was right for this time because we needed to do things differently. And so she asked for a ministerial report to be done on what Maori felt needed to happen. That report, when it was finished, was called Pao Te Aratu, The New Dawn. When I read this, I didn't quite agree with some of the comments that were made from my perspective, but I'm sure that in what they were talking about was true, but hard to accept some of those truths. But there was 13 recommendations in that, and when I read through the recommendations of that report, I thought, my God, all they're asking for is good practice. That's all they were asking for. 3 of the recommendations I'm going to share with you today. The first one is, let the extended family have a say in what's happening to young children. Grandparents are saying, our kids are taken into custody of the state and we don't even know about it. That they were being lost not only to the families, but those young people were being lost to their culture. And so that was one of the challenges, that in the forum, appropriate forum, that families have a say in what's happening with young people. The other recommendation was provide joined up services for families. That services tend to be fragmented. We needed to work together in partnership and not in silos. And it was also part of the same recommendation, but the third point that was really strong was capture the resources of the extended family and the community at large to address the issues. Pretty common sense sort of statements. But it's those statements that brought about in New Zealand the family group conference process. It's used both in welfare for children and in youth justice. And from that, it's grown into other areas in New Zealand. We now use it, restorative justice in schools. We have restorative justice conferences for adult offenders. We have a Sentencing Act that allows judges to take into account restorative justice outcomes when sentencing. And in the youth justice, which is the most advanced, unless a young person is arrested and the grounds for arrest are actually in our legislation, unless the young person is arrested, the police cannot lay the charges in court until a family group conference has been held. And if it is laid in court, a judge can't sentence a young person unless a family group conference has been held. So it's actually written into our legislation. The result of this is we do about 7,000 of these a year. So we've gained a lot of experience in doing this. We've seen what's good practice and what's bad practice. But what I have witnessed is a massive healing in New Zealand between the cultures, because the model that we adapt is, in New Zealand, it's actually how you convene the meeting. It's the most critical part. You have to consult with the family about their decision-making processes. How do they meet? How do they come together? Where do they come together? And you design the family group conference around that. You've designed the family group conference to suit the participants that are going to be part of that meeting, against another model that's been taken from the New Zealand model, which is a scripted model and the same for everybody. That's getting back to institutional racism, saying the same model suits everyone. We find that a little bit painful because we actually struggle to move away from that. The success that I've been able to witness in this model, I'm going to share through some stories. And the first story is about a mother I met with whose daughter had been charged with aggravated robbery. They held up a gas station with a weapon And the gas station owner wanted them to go to prison. Pretty horrible being threatened with a weapon and think your life might end. But in the family, when I met this woman, I asked her about her links, because it's not just blood family, it's whatever their network is we pull together. And she started crying, and I said, I'm sorry, what have I said that's upset you? And she said, no, it's not you, Allan. I've just realised how alone I am. She was a solo mum, trying to bring up 2 children on her own. I said, I can fix that. I can introduce you to people in the community that will stand by you. Individuals and organisations. And I told them about the different organisations that were there and the different people in those organisations, and said, who do you think would be best suited to you? So she chose one, and I said, have you got time to go and meet them? And I took her to meet them straight away. I introduced her to that organisation, then I left her to talk to them about her life and arranged to pick her up and take her home afterwards. It was agreed that this organisation would also host the family group conference. It was going to be there where her support was going to come from. The outcome of this family group conference is the police themselves decided, now aggravated robbery is purely indictable in New Zealand. Purely indictable means the court cannot dismiss it without giving the young person a record. But in the conference, the police were so confident with the support that was around this mother and her daughter that they agreed to withdraw the charges out of court. So the young person would not have a record. Now it's a pretty big call for the police to pull a charge that serious out of court, but they were confident the support that was put around that family, the steps they were going to make forward, that if this plan was completed, they would withdraw the charges out of court and not relay them. But if she didn't complete it, then they would go forward with the prosecution. So a lot of motivation for that young woman to complete it. But the family group conference is confidential, and a surprising thing happened in there. The police said, we want to use the confidentiality of this conference to tell you, and to talking to the mother, we know you've been selling drugs, but we're very confident you are selling it to support your children. Now you've got that support that's been put around you for this conference, we want to tell you you need to stop, because if you don't, we're going to be charging you. That young woman went ahead and completed her plan, and because we had linked her and her mother and her family within the community and gave them community support that stayed with them, they never came to notice again. They were Maori. They were in the high risk bracket of reoffending. And I am confident they would have if we'd used the traditional legal process. So we've gone from a family that felt very alone to one that felt embedded in their community. And Judge Carruthers said that what we were really good at was creating communities around young people. And that's exactly what we're setting out to do. The next case I want to share with you is careless driving causing death. When I went to visit the father, he was very emotionally distraught about having lost his son. Him and his wife had only separated a couple of months before the incident. And the young man that was killed was also engaged to get married. So I had 3 victims. I had the mother, who had totally different needs from the father, and the fiancée, who had her own needs. I thought, this is going to be bigger than Ben-Hur. I've got a major job on my task here. And I wondered how we're going to deal with it in a family group conference. The father was investigating all things about his son's bicycle, the lights on the bike, because he had heard that blame was being put on the son for not being visible enough. And he didn't want any of the responsibility for his son's death to fall on his son. When I went to visit him, he offered me a seat to sit on. When I went to that seat, it had a white cross on it. The white cross is made in New Zealand to put alongside the road where someone's killed. And you often, if you ever get to go to New Zealand as a tourist, you'll often see some of these white crosses marking the side of the road. I picked up that cross and handed it to him. If I'd picked it up and put it on the floor, I would have been dead meat. So I took someone with me because I knew this was going to be a very emotional meeting. And he told me about the research he was doing and stuff like that. And I thought one of the things I need to know, and he needs to know, is what really happened. So I asked the police to bring along the person who investigated the scene so that everyone would understand clearly how this accident happened. Now, one of the processes that's built into the family group conference process, the coordinator can invite people along to give information. They're not there as decision makers. They just purely come to give information. Because it's a role of the coordinator, and that's the role I was in, was to make sure the conference has got the information it needs to make good decisions. And the law gives me the right to bring people along for that purpose. So the New Zealand model is actually legislated. It's actually in our legislation. A coordinator is a statutory appointment. And where most roles of a social worker end with the chief executive, the family group conference responsibility ends with the coordinator. It's a very powerful role in our legislation. So this police officer agreed to come, but he said, I can't believe this is being dealt with in a family group conference. I don't believe that this is appropriate forum for it. His colleague said, well, there's no choice actually. The law says it's got to go. Judge Carruthers, the principal youth court judge, just before the conference, invited me up to meet 5 Australian judges. And I said to him, I don't think I'm going to make it. I've got a very difficult conference to run. And he said, oh, what is it? And I explained it to him. He said, yeah, I can understand, Alan, how you probably won't be able to make it. But if for some reason you can, we'd love to see you. So I ran that conference. And the officer that investigated the scene, the careless driving part of the charge was purely because the young driver had not gone to the centre of the intersection before turning. If he'd gone to the centre of the intersection, he would have seen the bike that was behind the car that was approaching the intersection. Now, how many of us have cut a corner in our driving, not gone to the very centre of an intersection? So his fault was very minor, but it had very tragic outcomes. This helped take the relief away from the father. I had to facilitate the meeting so he was able to have his say, but in a way that didn't seem abusive to his wife that he had just separated, and the fiancé had their needs. And I won't go into a lot of detail of that because it would take the rest of the day to go through everything that happened in that conference. But the outcomes for that conference were very powerful. All the family wanted was for him to give support, the offender, to give support to the organisations that supported them in their grief, to do 2 safety seminars with the police to other young people because they thought they would listen to him more than from adults, and for him to write to them a summary of his experiences in doing that sort of work. That was basically, and he lost his licence for a year and 1 day because if you do that in New Zealand you've got to resit it, and they thought that would be a good learning for him to resit his driver's licence. That was the total outcome, and it was discharged without him having a conviction. The police officer felt it wasn't appropriate for him, said to me as leaving, Alan, I think this is the only place to deal with it now. So I did get up to see the other judges, and Judge Crowe said, why don't you start by telling them about the conference you just ran? Well, that was the worst thing he could have said, because I just broke down in tears. So I just bawled my eyes out for about 10 minutes in front of 5 judges. But they said, how could you ever deal with that in a conference? And Judge Carruthers said, how could you deal with it in a courtroom? It couldn't. There's no way you could have dealt with that in a courtroom and created the healing that had happened by the interaction between the young man who had killed their son in a road accident. And I've heard of similar experience. I helped Jessalyn Nash in Sonoma County to get conferencing started there, north of San Francisco. And they started getting vehicular manslaughter charges, and they had one there where the young offender shared how traumatised he was by the fact he'd killed his family's children in a car accident. The 3 children were killed. And that he felt like committing suicide. It ended with the parents of the children that were killed holding him and saying, "We don't want another death here. We understand the hurt you've had, and you understand the hurt that we've had, and we need to grieve together." So they said prayers together. It's this sort of healing that I've witnessed over and over again in this process that brings these emotions to me today. Another case I want to share with you is a young girl who I went and visited as a victim, and she was a victim of 3 times rape. The offender was a 16-year-old who had been taken to paedophile meetings by his mother since the age of 5. The police reduced the charges to 3 times unlawful sexual connection. Now, it was very important in this case for people to understand that the offender had no normal boundaries, didn't understand any normal boundaries. The young girl who had been a victim of incest from as long as she could remember, and this young lad were placed in the same residence. And when he made his sexual advances, she coped with it the way she coped with her incest. She shut down her mind and escaped to somewhere else and just let it happen. So because she'd done that the first time, he came back and back. When I met with her, she said, "I don't want to be in the same room with him, but I want to see the conference." I thought, well, that's a challenge. She's 14 years old, wants to see the conference, but doesn't want to be in the same room with him. I thought, oh, I've got a video camera. There's a TV in the office. So I set up so she could sit in the next room and watch the conference on television. And she had the support person with her and a social worker with her. And because she wasn't in the conference itself, she had a representative in the conference. During the conference, she wrote 3 letters for her support person to read out. Her first one is, "You're not taking enough responsibility for what you did to me." The second one was, "I don't want him to lose his job. I want him to keep his job because I want him to pay for my self-defense lessons." The agreement that came out of the conference was that social welfare would pay for her defence lessons, but they couldn't pay for the friend that she wanted to go with her. So the offender paid for the friend to go with her. And the third one that she asked for in the third letter is, "I want parts of this city that I can go and know that I'll never ever run into you, that I can socialise, mix." So this, again, was a very, very serious charge. It would be extremely unusual for it not to be an incarceration. And the police weren't confident in making the decision. They agreed with the outcome, but they said, "Allan, if we take this as an agreement, then it's on us. What we'd rather have is a non-agreement and have the judge make the decision." So what the conference agreed to, it agreed to not agree, but agreed that the lawyer that was representing the offender could write down the plan and present it in court, and the police said they wouldn't challenge it. I've seen the law manipulated to get good outcomes. Another case was an aggravated robbery where the young offender went back and the person that was looking after the garage was lying on the floor as instructed, done exactly what he was told, what his employer told him to do. This boy was told to go back by the adults and stomp his head in. So he did. He went back and stomped his head in. This victim was an A-grade student at Victoria University and would never ever do better than B from the rest of his life. The father attended the conference on his son's behalf. And his father said, I want you to go to jail for what you did to my son. I really believe you should go to jail for what you did to my son. But I don't want you to go for too long. The next thing is the conference discussing which is the best level of court to put it in to get the right outcome for the father. If you put it in the district court, they would see it at the most serious end of what they do and probably give them 5 years. You put it in the high court and they'd compare it and probably only give 2 years. So the conference agreed not to, for a non-agreement on the grounds that his lawyer would lodge it in the high court. Some pretty powerful stuff going on, way beyond just restorative justice. Another case, and this will be the last example I give you, was where the victims and everyone agreed this young person had needs that needed to be addressed before they could be held accountable. And the social worker said they could get them in this program, they'd be in that program for 3 months, and then could we deal with the restorative justice stuff, putting things right with the victim. And the conference agreed, and that was taken to the judge, and the judge said, no, I don't agree, I don't want it on remand that long. I'm directing you to go back and run the conference again. So I went back and told the conference, this is the judge's decision. So they debated it, and then they come up and said, we actually agree with our first decision. And so did the police. So the police withdrew the charges out of the court so the judge wouldn't have a say. That plan was completed perfectly. The young person knew the opportunity they were being given and they stuck to it. We are extending the youth of youth justice into many fields, as I've mentioned, and we're looking at, there's a place for restorative justice and working with young people when they're incarcerated. There's a partnership for youth justice in managing their release and their transition back into the community. Because if we don't handle that, we just leave them in another position of being vulnerable to go back in. And right now we're piloting a process for doing that in New Zealand, and I have the lead on it. And so far it's working very well. But we're using conferences to plan the young person's release, and then we're using them 2 weeks after release to make sure everything's on task, everything that's said and done being done, and then we're running them every 2 months to make sure. Now, imagine a partnership of people working together like that against the sole probation officer trying to manage a caseload of people. Social workers, probation officers are mainly a 9-to-5 job. These young people need support way beyond that, especially in evenings and weekends when they're most vulnerable to get into trouble. Family group conferences are bound to partnership up community resources with professionals to achieve that. And that's one of the strengths of capturing the resources of the extended family and the community at large. We can virtually put 24-hour support around young people. The judges in New Zealand that were working in the youth court saw the imagination, the options that were coming out of this. And so they formed a judicial pilot to advocate to get it into the adult system. Now, judges are not going to do that unless they feel there's some real value in doing it. And that led to the Sentencing Act in New Zealand to allow restorative justice in adult court proceedings. Now, restorative justice is not an alternative to the normal justice process. It's been developed over centuries. But what it does very well is gives the court an extra set of tools. It helps work out in a far more comprehensive way of which ones actually need to be before a court, so that the court's time is not burdened with unnecessary cases, and they can put their specialist area into greater depth with the young people or the adults they're working with because they've got more time. And so the courts have become more effective at their work. And we've reduced the caseloads on courts so dramatically that, as you've heard, even Wellington Court, which was an all-day affair, is down still today, only 2 hours a week. And the average number of young people in court is 6. 3 checking on their plans and 3 new cases. For the capital of New Zealand, population is about 180,000 people. So that's some of our experiences. We've dropped the use of court dramatically, we've dropped the use of incarceration dramatically, and we incarcerate not under a justice model but a welfare model. Youth justice is the partnership of the best of both. Wellington, as you heard, reduced youth offending by 2/3 over 3 years, and that was because it captured the resources of the community. And Judge Carruthers, in a video clip I've got, has said that a truly restorative community is not limited to what the court can provide, it's not limited to what the welfare services can provide or the probation service, it's limited to what the nation can provide. The generosity, the skills that I've seen in communities has been amazing. And 2 of the projects we ran in Wellington, and I'll finish with just quickly with these, Maori youth, which were prospectors, the Black Power gang, were causing 68% of our court appearances. We reduced that down to 1 person. By what we learnt about the young people we dealt with in family group conferences, told us what their peer group was up to. So we got the community, the Maori community, to come round the whole peer group. And instead of them being a challenge to the young person that had a youth justice plan, they worked with them together through the changes. Then we've done the same for the Samoan community, and theirs were older. They were actually outside our age group that had big influence on the younger ones. So they were in the adult system, and they did have members of their gang in jail. And one of the key offenders doing aggravated robberies wanted to create a gang that was equivalent to any you'd see in LA or in South Auckland in New Zealand. And so we wanted to intervene while he was in prison. And I thought to myself, we were winning, we were getting ahead. The newspaper reported that crime in this area that this gang was in had almost disappeared within 5 weeks. Our goal of these programs that we ran was only to reduce burglaries over Christmas when people were on holiday, so we didn't come back to a high workload. But they actually ended up being permanent interventions. Crime got so low in that area, well, in Wellington City itself, that when I left through promotion, they never replaced me for 2 years. There wasn't enough work to keep someone going. And today, in that same community, one coordinator looks after Wellington City. It's half the size of Christchurch. So therefore, Christchurch, you'd think, would only have 2 coordinators. It's got 10. And that was the difference between getting the whole community involved and running a more nuclear family type approach. So if you're going to have restorative justice, the community needs to take ownership of it. It needs to be embedded in the community, and it needs to be a way of working for the whole community. And it should not be seen as in competition or in opposition to your normal justice processes, but a good partnership, and so that you empower the ability of each other. And that's the key message I suppose I could put across here today, is that we never went out to compete with anybody. We didn't create new programs. We used the people that already lived and worked in that community, that already were doing work. What we did is enhance their ability. When we developed a project, we brought them together in partnership. So community agencies that competed against each other for funding worked together. And we started that first by getting them to work together in a family group conference. And I had a victim, and this will be my final words because I'm over time, well and truly, but I had a victim at the end of conference come to me and say, "Allan, this is not going to work." And I said, "Why? What was wrong with this conference that made you feel that?" And he said, "No, it wasn't the conference." He said, "That was brilliant. It's my work experience." He said, "I'm a public servant, and we don't work cooperatively with another government department, let alone non-government departments. And you've got 6 agencies here that have to work together around one young person. That ain't going to work." 6 months later, when the plan was completed, he phoned me and said, "I've got to change my work ethic. You've proven to me the way I've worked, my working career, was wrong. I need to change it." those are the sort of stories that I can just go on endlessly with. I've had the experience of probably personally running about 1,500 family group conferences. And I had the opportunity for 18 months to manage it nationally, where we do between 7,000 and 8,000 FGCs a year, family group conferences a year. We've just had a new government, and every time we get a new government, they review our act. First thing they promise to do is get tough on youth offending and stuff like that. But every time, they end up enhancing it. And this is what's happening now. The new sentences we've put in place are alternatives to having young people in prison, but having them in a residential program that's more life skills based and having really good, strong support for them as they transition out. And that's for our top 40 offenders in the country. So we're looking at empowering the court and us in a stronger partnership for our future. Thank you.